Welcome to All About Data on Federal News Network. Now your host, Jory Heckman.
Thanks for joining me this week on All About Data, a conversation with chief data officers and the people who are making data work better in government. On today's episode, the IRS is staffing up with investigators to go after all sorts of criminal activity, but criminals are using artificial intelligence tools to launch more sophisticated fraud schemes and in greater volumes. But the agency's criminal investigation branch is also relying on AI tools to stay one step ahead of fraudsters. Here to talk about it is Jarod Koopman, IRS Criminal Investigations Executive Director of Cyber and Forensics. Jarod, thanks for joining me. I wanted to start by discussing the scope of fraud, and if you could describe a little bit more of what, from your corner at the IRS, you guys are up against and what steps you're doing to stay ahead of fraudsters, recognizing that is always an evolving landscape.
We've seen not only fraud continue on the rise, but more sophisticated frauds in the way of AI, cyber components, in addition to traditional financial fraud, which is primarily the sector that IRS Criminal Investigation is 100% involved in, is just financial fraud. So you're talking about online payment fraud exceeding 360 billion. You're talking about check fraud skyrocketing. You've seen online cyber criminals exploiting more and more victims over the years, which has raised to billions in fraud in that space. You have a cryptocurrency market that just capped, over $1 trillion, which is continuing to grow and provide a ton more in the ecosystem, which from our standpoint continues to see a lot more in relation to scams, frauds, attacks. All the traditional stuff still there. We continue to advance into more sophisticated means, as well as increasing the volume so that the constant cycle continues where we're playing catch up here. And then to kind of the point of what we're doing to combat this, I think the agency's been in a good place over the last few years to continue to backfill for attrition and hiring additional agents and analysts. So over the last couple of years, we've actually been able to increase our employees on rolls a bit to help continue to meet the demands. And this is just basically getting us back to staffing levels that were back in the 90s and early 2000s. So nothing of significant growth, but definitely something that's been helping. And then also maintaining our level of sophistication in some of these areas, whether it's the advancing digital asset space to enhancing technologies, which we'll talk about, to AI and to all these other components. We tend to be an agency that's very flexible and nimble. We're small enough that we can drive kind of innovation. And that's really helped us, I think, in the long term.
You mentioned that fraudsters are taking advantage of some of these artificial intelligence tools. Beyond just the scope, the number of fraud attempts that I imagine has grown because of AI, how has the emergence of AI changed the variety of fraud schemes that you guys are seeing?
They certainly have changed some of the variety. I think the bigger issue or challenge is just increase the volume. So AI is exponentially advanced the capabilities of the criminals to do things at speed and at volume. So what used to take a significant amount of effort going into some type of a social media type exploit or hack, they can now do this with AI that's much more efficient, much more effective, and certainly much more volume at high speed. We have seen some new developments, AI being able to generate very sophisticated means by which to trick a lot of our built-in filters and things of that, especially within IRS. We're primarily dictated on data and data driving a lot of our analytics and being able to combat that. Criminals usually can exploit that by finding creative ways or ways to replicate this at scale, and AI's only enhance that. So yeah, definitely a lot of different challenges there. And then not to mention, you've heard of the deep fakes and everything else that have obviously been populating, and that kind of leads into misinformation or disinformation and how that actually drives a lot of the fraud that we're seeing pop up.
We've been talking about how AI tools can enable fraudsters to do more of what they do, but let's talk a little bit more about how those AI tools at the IRS are enabling the agency to stay ahead of these threats. How is the IRS taking advantage of AI tools to stay one step ahead of these schemes that are evolving over time?
The first part to answer that is to really understand that the agency as a whole, as a main IRS and the tax agency, is doing a ton of work in terms of like policy and governance around AI use and how we're using that for the data that exists. Right now, with an IRS criminal investigation, so outside of the tax administration component, we're using it to really use AI to help further and quicker, more efficiently utilize the data that we have at hand. So this could be our operational data that we've actually seized from all of our previous cases or ongoing cases. It could be third-party data that we utilize from existing sources, whether it's open source intelligence or blockchain analytic data for cryptocurrency. All of that data is pretty vast and it's large volumes of data. AI has certainly made us much more effective and efficient in sifting through that to find patterns, to identify fraud methodologies or typologies, to identify current threats or vectors that might be red flags of issues that we were not aware of prior. And to do that at a speed that, yes, we could have done it without AI, but it would have taken us, years, months, if not years, to actually comb through and come up with those type of models and things of that nature. So becoming more efficient, optimizing our resources, and then certainly finding new ways to utilize AI, whether it's internal, like for reports, or just becoming more efficient in that capability. I think it's one thing to understand that the service in itself is not at the stage yet where, and nor do I think we'll get there, where we're using AI in terms of like a generative type component to, come up with methods to screen out bad actors or use the data to find taxpayers that are doing something that are illegal using a model. It's more using the data we have to drive that component versus the AI to do all of that type of thinking. So it's still very much a human in the loop type aspect when it comes to it.
Yeah, could you unpack that a little bit further? Because I think obviously whenever we talk about AI in the workplace, there's always that conversation of what the AI does and doesn't do. And from what I'm hearing from you, Jarod, it sounds like the AI is good at flagging things, red flags potentially for human investigators to then investigate further, take a closer look at. Can you explain a little bit more of the breakdown?
Yeah, we rely on the AI to help us sift through that data more effectively. Right. And that's really the primary role, is like having AI and large language models be able to match up against our data internally to be able to give us the results and the outputs that we're looking for to make decisions, not for the AI to use the data to make decisions directly. There's still that human in the loop element that we want to find the biggest and best investigations and biggest and most beneficial investigations that we should be working, right? We're a small agency. We should be on cases that we add value to for the most value to add. And in order to do that, we're only as good as the analytics or where the case information comes from. So if we can use AI to better that, to find those larger financial fraud, larger cases that will have the most impact to society, to the financial sector, we want to use AI to do that. And if we can continue to build and develop the models and the typologies, and then mix that with external data, and that's where this third party aspect comes in, where there's a ton of information that exists outside of the service and what we have collected, and that's where you get into leveraging more of the privacy enhanced technologies to be able to allow kind of data to be utilized inside and outside of the agency.
Again, not to give away too much in terms of sources and methods, and I know you guys have to keep a close hold on some of that, but can you talk a little bit more about some of that outside information, some of that third-party information, what the IRS finds valuable, going back to your point about privacy-enhancing technologies, striking that balance, understanding like where those red lines are of what data-wise the IRS can and can't do?
To answer the first part, what we see is these different buckets of data. We utilize a lot of third-party information for open source intelligence. So this would be anything that's publicly available, that's filed somewhere, that yes, we could go find it ourselves. But again, there's tons of companies that have aggregators that pull this data in, whether it's publicly filed information at courts or other components, whether it's social media, whether it's chat forums that are open and available. All of this information is relevant to a criminal case or to uncovering potential threat vectors. So we use a lot of those third-party data providers, including blockchain analytics. As I mentioned, you can think about all the transactions that occur in open blockchain that's publicly available. We also work with our international partners. And some of them could be law enforcement. Some of them could be just international regulatory regimes that have data that can provide us information, and vice versa. In all of that, those are important components to actually have the benefit of insight, as well as financial institutions. So banking industry is a great source of information. And outside of just the BSA, Bank Secrecy Act information, just more generally, they have a ton of information that's available. This is all critical information to IRS criminal investigation. Now, IRS Maine has the tax administration. They're primarily using the tax information to drive a lot of the administration of tax enforcement and compliance. But from the criminal side, when we're actively trying to uncover a known criminal entity or organization, all information is open and available to us that's within our legal means. Now, to your point of this balance of sharing data and third party, we can always accept data, right? It's always, we love to receive data because it only enhances our capabilities of what we can do. The difference being is sharing the information outside. Now, there's two things here. Sharing with other law enforcement certainly is relevant for deconfliction and other capabilities. And international partners, same thing when it's falls within the legal confines of being able to do so. But then also with our third parties, you can think about many of these third-party data providers are data queries that go through maybe a web-based license or some type of a query that we need, and we have no other ability to gain access to that in an efficient way. Now, the idea here is up until several years ago, the technology, I mean, it existed, but not for mass scale. Technology wasn't there in order to provide an easy way to transact, where if we want to correspond with a third party, we have to provide them with some type of a name or a social or something or a handle to be able to get information back. There's a trust factor there, and there's also a risk tolerance that we have to provide something in order to get the information that we wouldn't readily have available otherwise. But now, using privacy enhanced technologies, it allows us to share that data to those third-party providers or to our law enforcement partners in a manner that is both encrypted, can run analytics or other models against that data without ever having access to our source data. So it exists to be able to do all same aspects that you want to without actually providing that name or that PII or that actual data set itself. So all the data remains encrypted at storage, at rest, and in transit in order to be able to perform all the same functions. And that's really a game changer when you start talking about some of these capabilities that we're looking to do internally, because it just further enhances the security of the data that the government has and that all of these other partners have, and not constantly shifting around information that's pretty valuable, to criminals and others.
As far as those privacy enhancing technologies, can you talk a little bit more about how that might make some of the data sharing that exists between agencies a little more seamless? I know that can be a point of contention, just again, because of the sensitive nature of some of these data sets. It can be a long process for agencies to link up and do the kinds of things that you just described.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges in that. I mean, you can start with technology. A lot of times, law enforcement agencies, third parties, international partners, financial institutions, they're at varying degrees of what their technology internal infrastructure contains. So, I mean, some may be running on legacy systems. Some may be running on infrastructure that doesn't have an easy pipeline to share data, sitting behind firewalls that are very sophisticated, that are tough to share external data. So all these things come into play, and that's more of an infrastructure challenges. But when you don't have to move the data and actually send big bulk amounts of data, there's a benefit there in just the technology infrastructure. Then on top of that, you have all of these parties that they don't want to be responsible for controlling large sensitive amounts of data from a third party perspective. So it eliminates the risk from their end. And then also there is some sensitivity to even amongst law enforcement groups, because we may have something that's sensitive to us that actually could potentially affect, national security or other components that is very unique and shouldn't be kind of pushed out to different groups, even within the law enforcement community. So you have to be cognizant of that and sharing that information amongst all of the members. So the benefit of using these privacy enhanced technologies to never share the source data, never to provide these entities or these the PII, personal identifying information, to anyone else, provides this huge benefit so that we could share sensitive data, grand jury data. You could be stuff that is otherwise kind of off limits, or even high side intelligence. Think of like Department of Defense and other components that could be shared for deconfliction, for enhancement, for AI training models to run more efficiently. All of that could be utilized to enhance kind of the work that we're doing across the board. And I think that last point, that's where I think we can work with a lot of these AI companies, with private sector, with academia and education foundations. I mean, that what they need in order to do a lot of their research and modeling is data. And up until now, we've only been able to provide synthetic data and information that looks and feels like the real data, but it's really generated. And that helps us to build models. But you need that at scale. You need lots of it. And for us to basically create synthetic data is another work product that needs to be generated and created. And we can't do it to the levels that we actually have real data. So this changes that capability to be at a point where we have unlimited data. I mean, not unlimited, but we have a lot of data in the government. And if we can use all of that data in a manner that is completely protected to share with all of our partners to enhance the way we work more efficiently and effectively with AI and other components, why wouldn't we? That to me is like a huge benefit. We've kind of turned the tables a lot.
As far as like use cases and things that are case in point of how this is being deployed at the IRS, one thing I've heard from Commissioner Werfel, over the course of this year is, the IRS enforcement-wise has been taking a closer look at millionaires and folks making more than $400,000 who are years long overdue on tax debts and recouping $1 billion+ there. I mean, is this something that is being used to that effect, or are there other case studies or other use cases that you can shine a light on here?
It's being reviewed for use in that exact scenario currently. And what they want to make sure they're doing, it's not right now, but what they want to make sure they're doing is implementing in a way that is very unbiased and done in a way that's governed and utilized to ensure both the privacy, but also the integrity of kind of the application of the tax law. Tax law is complicated enough. Now you start trying to apply that to models to try to find, the right folks. You can see where that becomes a big challenge to make sure we're doing it in a correct manner. But to your point, in theory, that is exactly what it should be used for, right? Is to go through large scale amounts of data to find those individuals that have not filed their taxes, that are taking advantage of, these vast structures to cheat, not to effectively use the tax code, but to cheat their way out of their taxes. And also there's a ton of information publicly that they've bought houses and yachts and cars, and they're getting away with that information. That's all stuff that could be effectively and efficiently done by AI to generate and find those type of analytical touch points to be able to highlight for the agency. So that's exactly where we're trying to get to. I think from the criminal standpoint, though, our use cases are more to start with, and I say the easy ones, but they're not easy. The law enforcement deconfliction itself is something that is for years been a challenge. So how do we know that, one agency is looking at an individual or an entity and another agency is as well, or that there's information that crosses over? That's a big challenge because there's not like one big data repository that holds everything. So we have to share data across, and that becomes challenging because you don't want to share everything because some of it is governed by national security, top secret, grand jury, things that really are regulated by law, but there's an obligation to make sure that we're deconflicting that information. So that's a prime use case. That's one that we're looking at. Can we have the ability to deconflict all of this data without any other agency having access to the other agency's data? So that's a great use case. And then certainly I mentioned earlier the third-party queries, where we all agencies work with many third parties that have been instrumental to this, like public-private partnerships, to provide us with data that's been aggregated. Again, whether it's dark web forums, public information, blockchain analytics, there's tons of information. But in order for us to reach out to those companies, we have to provide them some information to get a response. These type of privacy enhanced technologies allows us to do that in a very secure manner that doesn't ever expose that data to our third party companies. And yeah, they all have contracts, non-disclosure agreements, things in place. But the more we can now implement technology to actually safeguard that material, much more of a better scenario.
I wanted to circle back to the hiring piece of things. You said that IRS Criminal Investigations generally has kind of gotten to a level of staffing that they saw, back in the 90s, back in the 2000s. Can you go into a little bit more detail about getting these folks on board?
Yeah, currently we're sitting at about 3,500 employees. 3,500 is made up of roughly about 2,500 special agents and about 1,000 professional staff, and that balance somewhere in that ballpark. And that's a pretty good increase for us over the last several years, to probably rise up from about 2,700 up to that 3,500 number. Very small still. I mean, when you start comparing kind of us, we're the sixth largest federal agency in the U.S. government, behind, the FBI, HSI, these big, large agencies. But, some of these agencies have 30, 40,000 employees, versus us coming in at 3,500. We're also a very small portion of the IRS as a whole, who IRS is, you can, imagine, is a 70,000 employees that handles the significant task of tax administration. We are a very small part for the criminal side. But in that function, to the hiring component, we are looking for folks that have kind of the skill sets that kind of range across the board. So it's not just tax. You don't have to be a tax expert. Many of us do have a tax background or tax involvement as a either prior education or prior work, but we do a lot of other components. So we hire folks in international banking, anti-money laundering, folks that are versed in cybercrime or cryptocurrency, a very specific skill set, but one that is very much needed because of the uniqueness to that field and that space. And we all have to have, as a part of our requirement for our job, have to have a background in accounting. But we've hired a lot of outstanding folks, and we've seen, I think, more recently, just a really elevated workforce that we're excited about.
That was Jarod Koopman, IRS Criminal Investigations Executive Director of Cyber and Forensics. You can find more data coverage as well as more episodes of All About Data on federalnewsnetwork.com. I'm Jory Heckman, and thanks for listening to this episode of All About Data.
Thanks for listening to All About Data on Federal News Radio, part of Federal News Network. You can listen to this episode and past episodes anytime in your favorite podcast app. Search for All About Data on Podcast One, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your shows.